On May 31, 1945, a 23-year-old private stood alone on a bullet-swept hillside in Okinawa and did something no one thought possible. For 12 days, an entire American division had hurled themselves against this fortress and been turned back in blood. But on this day, one man rose to his feet in full view of the enemy, walked straight into a storm of fire that should have killed him in seconds, and single-handedly broke the back of Japan's last great defensive line. What happened on Hen Hill defies belief, yet every word of it is true. This is the story of Clarence Craft and the most impossible 5 hours of the Pacific War. The island of Okinawa in the late spring of 1945 was not merely a battlefield. It was a graveyard in the making, a place where the earth itself seemed to conspire with human violence to create conditions of unimaginable suffering. By the time the calendar turned to May, the American advance had ground to a crawl against a defensive system the Japanese had spent months perfecting, a labyrinth of caves and tunnels and reinforced positions carved into the volcanic rock and coral limestone that formed the island's broken spine. The rain fell almost constantly, transforming the red clay soil into a sucking morass that swallowed men to their knees, that turned every step into an exhausting act of will, that made the simple act of moving forward feel like wading through an ocean of mud beneath a sky that offered no mercy and no respite from the horror unfolding below. The 96th Infantry Division, known as the Deadeyes, had been fighting on Okinawa since the initial landings on April 1st, and by late May they had been in continuous combat for nearly 2 months, an eternity in the compressed time of war where days stretched into weeks and weeks felt like years. The division had been tasked with breaking through the eastern anchor of the Shuri Line, the formidable Japanese defensive network that stretched across the southern portion of the island, a carefully engineered killing zone designed to extract the maximum possible price for every yard of ground. The men of the 96th had paid that price again and again, attacking across open ground, climbing exposed ridges, assaulting fortified positions that seemed to regenerate themselves overnight no matter how many times they were bombed or shelled or stormed by infantry. The landscape was apocalyptic, a moonscape of craters and destroyed vegetation, of shattered trees reduced to blackened splinters, of the sweet sick smell of death that hung in the humid air and clung to everything, that got into your nostrils and your clothes and your very skin until you couldn't remember what clean air tasted like. Among the most stubborn obstacles facing the division was a terrain feature designated on military maps with the prosaic name of Hill 153, but known to the men who had been dying against its slopes simply as Hen Hill. The name itself was a dark joke, a piece of soldier humor born from the hill's rounded profile that vaguely resembled a chicken when viewed from certain angles, though there was nothing remotely amusing about the reality of the place. Hen Hill was a fortress, a natural strong point that the Japanese had transformed into a layered defensive position of terrifying effectiveness. The hill's slopes were steep and largely bare, offering minimal cover to attackers, while its crest and reverse slope were honeycombed with caves, spider holes, trenches, and bunkers, all mutually supporting, all designed to create interlocking fields of fire that could sweep every approach with machine guns, rifles, mortars, and grenades. The Japanese defenders, professional soldiers who had no intention of surrendering, had spent weeks improving these positions, stockpiling ammunition and supplies, preparing for the siege they knew was coming. For 12 days, American forces had attempted to take Hen Hill, and for 12 days they had been repulsed. Companies had been reduced to platoons, platoons to squads, squads to handfuls of exhausted survivors who stumbled back down the muddy slopes having gained nothing except more names for the casualty lists. The problem was fundamental and seemingly insoluble. To take the hill, men had to climb it, and to climb it meant exposing themselves to fire from positions they couldn't see, couldn't suppress, couldn't neutralize without closing to grenade range, and closing to grenade range meant walking through a gauntlet of fire so intense that it seemed to physically push men backwards, that created a barrier as tangible as any wall. Officers had tried every approach their training and experience could devise. Artillery barrages that churned the hilltop into a smoking wasteland that somehow still erupted with fire the moment infantry appeared. Flanking movements that were detected and cut down. Night attacks that ended in confusion and death in the darkness. But nothing worked, nothing broke the deadlock, and with each passing day the casualties mounted and the urgency grew because Hen Hill was the key, the hinge upon which the entire Shuri line turned, and until it fell the advance could not continue. Private First Class Clarence Burleycraft was not a professional soldier. not a West Point graduate or a pre-war regular who had spent years mastering the military arts. He was a farm boy from California, a young man who had grown up in the hard years of the Depression, who had learned to work with his hands and to endure discomfort without complaint, who possessed the kind of steady competence that comes from years of physical labor and the kind of quiet determination that was more common in his generation than perhaps in any before or since. He had been drafted into the Army, trained as an infantryman, shipped across the Pacific to this nightmare island, and assigned to Company G, 2nd Battalion, 382nd Infantry Regiment, 96th Infantry Division. He was not notably different from thousands of other young men fighting on Okinawa, except perhaps for his skill with his weapon. Kraft was an exceptional marksman, the kind of soldier who could work his M1 Garand with the smooth efficiency of a craftsman using a familiar tool, who could acquire targets quickly and put rounds on them with devastating accuracy even under the stress of combat. But marksmanship alone did not explain what he was about to do, because what he did on May 31, 1945, was not merely skilled, it was transcendent, an act that seemed to exist outside the normal bounds of human capability and battlefield possibility. The morning of May 31 dawned gray and oppressive, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened more rain, the air thick with moisture that made breathing feel like inhaling warm soup. Company G had been ordered to conduct yet another reconnaissance patrol toward Hen Hill, a mission that everyone understood was a prelude to another assault, another attempt to crack the fortress that had already consumed so many lives. Kraft was assigned to a 6-man patrol, a small team tasked with probing the Japanese defenses, identifying positions, perhaps finding some weakness that had been overlooked in the previous 12 days of failure. It was the kind of mission that could go wrong very quickly, that required men to venture into ground dominated by the enemy, to deliberately draw fire in order to locate its source, to operate with minimal support and maximum risk. As Kraft checked his equipment that morning, ensuring his rifle was clean despite the omnipresent mud, filling the 8-round end-block clips for his Garand and securing them in his cartridge belt, fixing his bayonet and checking that his grenades were properly secured, he could not have known that within hours he would be doing something that no one had done before, that he would become a legend not through deliberate heroism but through an instinctive response to circumstances that would have broken most men. The patrol moved out in the mid-morning, 6 men walking carefully through the devastated landscape, using whatever cover the cratered ground provided, watching the hill ahead with the heightened alertness of soldiers who knew they were being watched in return. The approach to Hen Hill offered almost no concealment. The artillery barges had stripped away most of the vegetation, leaving a bare slope of mud and rock and shattered coral, a killing ground where movement drew fire as surely as iron draws lightning. The patrol advanced in bounds, one man moving while others covered, a textbook approach that was supposed to minimize exposure, but which felt desperately inadequate in the face of the hill's malevolent presence. They could see the dark mouths of caves pocking the hillside, could sense the eyes watching from spider holes and trenches, could feel the tension building like electricity in the air before a storm. Then, with the sudden violence that characterized combat on Okinawa, the hill erupted. The ambush came from multiple directions simultaneously, a carefully orchestrated outbreak of fire that demonstrated the Japanese defenders' tactical sophistication and their intimate knowledge of the ground. Rifles cracked from concealed positions, the distinctive reports echoing across the slope, and almost immediately 3 members of the patrol went down, wounded, crying out in pain and shock as bullets found flesh. Machine gun fire joined the fusillade, the heavy stuttering of a Nambu weapon sweeping across the patrol's position, kicking up geysers of mud and coral fragments, forcing the unwounded men to throw themselves flat, to press their bodies into whatever minimal depression or fold in the ground might offer protection. Kraft hit the dirt hard, feeling the impact jar through his bones, his face pressed into mud that tasted of sulfur and decay, his mind racing through the tactical calculus of survival. 3 men down, 3 men still able to fight but pinned in place by fire so intense that raising your head meant almost certain death, caught in the open with wounded comrades who would die without immediate evacuation, facing an enemy who held every advantage of terrain and position and preparation. It was a situation that called for withdrawal, for calling in artillery support, for getting the wounded back to friendly lines and regrouping for another attempt under better conditions. That was what training dictated, what doctrine prescribed, what any reasonable assessment of the tactical situation demanded. Clarence Kraft did not withdraw. What happened in Kraft's mind in those crucial seconds will never be fully known. because courage of this magnitude resists explanation, operates according to a logic that transcends rational calculation. Perhaps he made a conscious decision that the wounded men would not survive a withdrawal under fire, that their only chance was to suppress the enemy positions immediately and decisively. Perhaps he acted on instinct, some deep wellspring of aggression and determination that combat awakened in certain men. Perhaps he simply reached a point where fear gave way to fury, where the accumulated stress of weeks of combat crystallized into a cold rage that demanded action rather than passive endurance. Whatever the internal process, the external result was unmistakable. Kraft rose to his feet in full view of the enemy, standing upright on the exposed slope while bullets snapped past him with sounds like tearing fabric, while machine gun tracers drew lines of fire through the air around his body, and he began to shoot. The M1 Garand in Kraft's hands became an instrument of surgical precision, each shot a deliberate act of violence aimed at a specific target. He fired with the smooth rhythm that marked an expert rifleman, the semi-automatic weapon allowing him to maintain a steady rate of fire without the frantic bolt working required by the bolt-action rifles that had dominated the previous war. He could see muzzle flashes from Japanese positions and he aimed at them, aiming at the source of fire, and his shots went home, silencing weapons, forcing defenders to take cover, creating a momentary suppression that was just enough to give the wounded men below him a chance to crawl to safety. But Kraft did not simply stand and shoot. He began to advance, to walk uphill toward the enemy positions in a display of aggression so audacious that it seemed to violate every principle of infantry tactics and every instinct of self-preservation. He moved deliberately, not running but walking with steady purpose, firing as he advanced, working his rifle with mechanical efficiency, inserting fresh clips when the distinctive ping of the N-block ejecting signaled an empty weapon, and continuing forward without pause or hesitation. The Japanese defenders must have been as shocked as the American witnesses, because for a moment the fire directed at Kraft seemed to slacken, as if the enemy soldiers could not quite process what they were seeing, could not reconcile the reality of a single man advancing alone under fire with their expectations of how American infantry operated. But the moment of shocked immobility passed and the fire intensified, rifles and machine guns concentrating on this solitary figure, who would become the focus of the entire battle. Bullets struck the ground around Kraft's feet, throwing up spurts of mud and rock fragments that stung his legs, tore through his uniform, and somehow missed vital organs and major bones by margins measurable in inches. Grenades arced through the air from Japanese positions on the crest, tumbling down the slope and exploding with sharp cracks that sent shrapnel whining through the air, any one piece of which could have killed or maimed him. Mortar rounds began to fall, the defenders calling for indirect fire support to deal with this impossible threat, the shells bursting in black flowers of explosive force that walked closer to Kraft's position with each adjustment. The noise was overwhelming, a continuous roar of gunfire and explosions that would have made communication impossible even if there had been anyone to communicate with, that created a physical pressure in the air that seemed to press against eardrums and chest and sanity itself. And still Kraft climbed, his boots finding purchase on the slippery slope, his body leaning into the hill's incline, his rifle firing with metronomic regularity. He could see Japanese soldiers now, glimpses of helmets and faces in the mouths of caves and behind the edges of trenches, and he shot at everything he could see, not wild panic shooting but aimed fire, each shot intended to kill or suppress, each shot a tactical decision made in the fractional seconds between one step and the next. The distance to the crest was perhaps 200 yards, a distance that in other circumstances might be covered in 2 or 3 minutes of walking, but here each yard was contested, each step forward an act of will and defiance that seemed to occur outside normal time, stretching seconds into eternities and compressing minutes into heartbeats. Kraft's legs burned with the exertion of climbing under combat load. His breathing came hard and fast. His hands worked the rifle with movements that were more reflex than conscious thought, and somewhere in his mind he must have known that he should be dead, that by every law of probability and military experience, he should have been cut down in the first seconds of his advance. And yet he was not. He continued forward, and the momentum of his assault began to create its own reality. As Kraft approached the military crest of the hill, the character of the fighting changed. He was close enough now that rifle fire from the trenches came nearly horizontal, close enough that he could see the expressions on the faces of enemy soldiers, close enough that grenades thrown from Japanese positions had almost no time to arm before they reached him. He began throwing his own grenades, the 2 Malawian Quachas fragmentation grenades that American infantry carried, pineapple-shaped explosives filled with TNT and surrounded by a serrated cast-iron body designed to fragment into lethal shrapnel. Kraft would pull a grenade from his ammunition belt, grasp it firmly, pull the pin with his other hand while keeping his thumb on the spoon, release the spoon to start the fuse burning, a 4 to 5 second delay before detonation, and throw the grenade in a smooth overhand motion learned in training but perfected under fire, sending the explosive arcing through the air to land in or near Japanese positions. The grenades exploded with sharp reports that were different from the deeper blast of mortar rounds, creating small storms of metal fragments that cleared trenches and forced defenders deeper into their bunkers and caves, and Kraft threw them with the same deliberate accuracy he brought to his rifle fire, each grenade aimed at a specific target, each explosion creating a brief window of suppression that allowed him to advance a few more yards. Behind Kraft, American soldiers watching from lower positions could scarcely believe what they were witnessing. Word spread rapidly along the line that a single man was assaulting Hen Hill alone, that someone was doing the impossible, and men who had been pinned down by fire began to move forward, not in a coordinated assault but in small groups and individuals who were drawn forward by the sheer audacity of Kraft's advance. Some of these men began to form an impromptu supply line, passing grenades forward from position to position, creating a chain that would eventually reach Kraft on the crest and allow him to continue his assault with an almost unlimited supply of explosives. Officers who might have ordered Kraft to fall back found themselves instead organizing support for his attack, directing men to provide covering fire, calling for artillery to shift to targets on the reverse slope of the hill, transforming what had begun as a one-man assault into a coordinated effort that exploited the breach Kraft was creating in the Japanese defenses. When Kraft finally reached the crest of Hen Hill, he found himself at the edge of a complex of trenches and fighting positions that represented weeks of Japanese engineering effort. The trenches were deep, revet with logs and sandbags, designed to protect defenders from artillery while providing firing positions that commanded all approaches. From the crest, Kraft could see down into the trench network, could see soldiers moving in the bottom of the cuts, could identify bunker entrances and the mouths of caves that tunneled deep into the hill's interior. And he began systematically destroying these positions with grenades, throwing one after another into the trenches in a fury of sustained violence that was unlike anything the defenders had experienced. The grenades exploded in rapid succession, the confined spaces of the trenches channeling the blast effects and multiplying the devastation, filling the air with smoke and dust and the screams of wounded men. Japanese soldiers attempted to return fire, to throw back the grenades before they detonated, to mount some kind of organized defense, but Kraft's assault was relentless. Each explosion followed immediately by another, giving the defenders no time to recover, no opportunity to reorganize, no chance to mount an effective counterattack. The grenade supply line that had formed behind Kraft now proved crucial, because the volume of explosives he was throwing exceeded anything a single man could carry. Grenades passed from hand to hand up the slope, arriving at Kraft's position in a steady stream that he converted into devastating firepower. He threw 2 full cases of grenades into the Japanese positions, 72 to 80 individual explosives, each one a tactical decision about where to throw it for maximum effect, each one a moment of extreme danger as Kraft exposed himself to throw it, each one contributing to the overwhelming cascade of violence that was breaking the defender's will to resist. His arm must have burned with fatigue from the constant throwing motion. His shoulder must have ached from the repetitive stress. But there was no pause, no rest, no moment of respite, because any pause would allow the enemy to regroup, would allow the momentum of the assault to dissipate, and momentum was everything now. Momentum was the force multiplier that allowed one man to defeat a fortified position that had withstood 12 days of concentrated attack. In the midst of this sustained bombardment, Kraft discovered something that would have made most men retreat immediately. Inside one of the caves he had been attacking with grenades, he spotted a satchel charge that had failed to detonate. Satchel charges were large explosive devices, typically containing multiple pounds of TNT or composition explosive, designed for demolition work and fortification destruction, powerful enough to collapse bunkers or seal cave entrances. This particular charge had been set by American engineers in an earlier attempt to clear the position, but the fuse had failed or been cut, leaving the explosive sitting inside the cave entrance, inert but still potentially functional. For Kraft, the satchel charge represented an opportunity. If he could get it to detonate, It would be far more effective than any grenade at destroying the cave system and killing the defenders inside. But retrieving a failed explosive device from an enemy position under fire, examining it to determine if it could be made functional, resetting the fuse, and then redeploying it required a combination of technical knowledge, physical courage, and cold-blooded determination that few men possessed. Kraft entered the cave under fire, moving into the semi-darkness of the entrance where the enemy could barely miss him if they chose to shoot, and reached the Satchel charge. He could see in the dim light that the fuse had pulled free from the charge, a simple mechanical failure that had prevented detonation, but the main explosive was intact and theoretically still functional. Working with hands that must have been trembling from adrenaline and exertion, operating under the knowledge that at any second a Japanese soldier might emerge from deeper in the cave system and kill him at point-blank range, Kraft reset the fuse, a delicate operation that required connecting the blasting cap to the main charge, ensuring the connection was secure, and preparing to light the time fuse that would give him a few precious seconds to get clear before the explosion. The technical details of what he did in that moment are less important than the extraordinary nature of the act itself. He was improvising demolition work inside an enemy fortification during active combat, displaying a level of technical competence and tactical flexibility that was remarkable even by the high standards of American infantry training. With the fuse reset, Kraft had to make another life-or-death decision. How much time to allow before detonation? Too much time and the Japanese might be able to throw the charge back out of the cave, or the defenders might escape through tunnels deeper in the system. Too little time and Kraft might not be able to get clear of the blast radius, might be caught by the explosion or by the cave collapse that would almost certainly follow. He chose to cut the fuse short, to give himself only a few seconds, and then he lit it, the spark of the igniter creating a brief flare in the cave's darkness, the fuse beginning to burn with a hissing, sputtering sound that was audible even over the general din of combat. Kraft backed out of the cave as quickly as he could while still moving carefully enough not to trip or stumble, and he had barely cleared the entrance when the Satchel charge detonated with a roar that dwarfed the sound of the grenades. A massive explosion that sent a shock wave rolling across the hilltop and created a blast of air that knocked nearby men to the ground. The cave entrance collapsed in an avalanche of rock and coral and earth, sealing the defenders inside in a tomb of stone, eliminating one of the hill's strongest defensive positions in a single devastating moment. The destruction of the cave marked a turning point in the battle for Hen Hill, because it demonstrated that the Japanese positions were not impregnable, that determination and violence applied with sufficient intensity could break even the strongest defense. Kraft continued his assault, moving along the crest of the hill from position to position, throwing grenades into every fighting position he encountered, shooting at targets of opportunity, maintaining constant pressure on defenders who were now beginning to crack under the sustained assault. His actions had created chaos in the Japanese defensive system, had disrupted communications and coordination, had forced defenders to fight as individuals rather than as coordinated elements, and individual soldiers could be defeated by a determined attacker with surprise and momentum on his side. Other American soldiers were reaching the crest now, following in Kraft's wake, expanding the breach he had created, beginning the process of systematically clearing the hill's defensive works. But it was Kraft who had made it all possible, Kraft who had done what entire companies had failed to do in 12 days of trying. The assault continued for approximately 4 to 5 hours, an eternity of sustained combat that tested the limits of human endurance and will. Kraft fought continuously throughout this period, without meaningful rest, without food or water beyond what he could carry, operating on reserves of energy and determination that seemed inexhaustible. By the time the fighting began to wind down, by the time it became clear that Hen Hill was finally in American hands, Kraft had personally killed at least 25 Japanese soldiers through a combination of rifle fire, grenades, and the Satchel charge explosion, had destroyed multiple defensive positions, had enabled the breakthrough that would lead to the collapse of the entire Shuri line and the eventual American victory on Okinawa. The tactical significance of what he had done was enormous. Hen Hill had been a keystone position, and its fall meant that the entire Japanese defensive system in southern Okinawa was now vulnerable to envelopment and collapse, that the grinding stalemate could finally be broken, that the advance toward the island's southern tip could resume. And somehow, miraculously, impossibly, Clarence Kraft walked away from Hen Hill without serious injury. His uniform was torn and mud-caked, his body was bruised and exhausted, his ears rang from hours of exposure to gunfire and explosions, but he was alive and functional, a statistical anomaly that defied everything known about infantry combat and the lethality of modern weapons. The fact of his survival was perhaps as remarkable as the assault itself, because by all rights he should have died a dozen times over, should have been hit by rifle fire or machine gun fire or shrapnel or concussive force from near-miss explosions, but luck or fate or divine providence had seen him through, and he descended from the hill he had conquered to rejoin his unit and continue the war. The Medal of Honor citation that would eventually be written for Kraft's actions on Hen Hill used the formal language of military awards, describing his conduct as exemplifying the highest traditions of military service, noting his conspicuous gallantry at risk of life above and beyond the call of duty, enumerating the specific acts of heroism and their tactical results in the precise bureaucratic prose that such documents require. But the words on paper, however carefully chosen, could not capture the full reality of what had occurred on that hillside, could not convey the visceral terror and physical exhaustion and mental strain of sustained close combat, could not adequately express the magnitude of the courage required to do what Kraft had done. The medal itself, when it was presented to him in a ceremony after the war, was a piece of metal and ribbon, a symbol of national gratitude that Kraft accepted with the same quiet humility he brought to everything else in his life, never seeking attention or acclaim, never speaking much about his experiences, carrying the weight of that day inside himself in ways that only other combat veterans could truly understand. Kraft's war did not end on Hen Hill, because the fighting on Okinawa continued for weeks after the fall of the Shuri Line, and even after Okinawa was secured there was still the question of what would come next. The expected invasion of the Japanese home islands that promised to be even more terrible than anything that had come before. But the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in early August 1945 ended the war before that invasion became necessary, and Kraft, like millions of other American servicemen, found himself transitioning from warrior to veteran, from active duty soldier to civilian, though the designation of civilian never quite fit men who had experienced what they had experienced. He returned to the United States, to a country that was jubilant with victory but already beginning to forget the cost of that victory, to a society that wanted to move forward into peace and prosperity and had little appetite for dwelling on the brutal details of how peace had been achieved. Kraft built a life for himself in the post-war years, married, raised a family, worked to support them, and if he carried scars from his time in combat they were internal, the kind that did not show in photographs or betray themselves in casual conversation. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, Kraft was recalled to active duty, because the military knew that men with his experience and proven courage were too valuable to leave in civilian life when another war demanded their service. He served in Korea as well, adding another campaign to his record, surviving another war in another country against another enemy, and when that service was complete he returned once again to civilian life, older now, bearing the accumulated weight of too much combat spread across too many years. In the decades that followed, Kraft found a way to transform his wartime experience into something constructive, something life-affirming rather than destructive, by volunteering at a Veterans Administration medical center where he spent thousands of hours over the course of 10 years helping other veterans navigate the physical and psychological aftermath of their own wars. It was quiet work, unglamorous work, the kind of service that never makes headlines or earns additional medals, but it was perhaps the truest expression of the values that had driven him up Hen Hill on that day in 1945. A refusal to abandon those who needed help, a willingness to endure hardship on behalf of others, a fundamental decency that transcended self-interest and personal comfort. Clarence Burley Kraft died in 2002 at the age of 80, having lived a long life by the standards of combat veterans, having been granted decades that many of his comrades never received, decades to experience the ordinary joys and sorrows of human existence that war had threatened to cut short. In the years after his death, the United States Postal Service designated a post office in Santa Ana, California as the Private First Class Clarence B. Kraft Post Office Building, a small recognition of his service, a way of ensuring that his name would remain attached to a piece of civic infrastructure, that people conducting the mundane business of mailing packages and purchasing stamps would pass beneath a sign bearing the name of a man who had done something extraordinary. It was a modest memorial, the kind of thing that most people would never notice or think about, but it represented a thread of connection between that day on Hen Hill and the peaceful present, a reminder that the freedom to live ordinary lives had been purchased at extraordinary cost by men like Kraft. The story of what happened on Hen Hill exists now primarily in official records, in the Medal of Honor citation and unit histories and after-action reports that document the Pacific War's countless battles and engagements. The men who witnessed Kraft's assault firsthand are gone now, the last of them passing away in the decades since the war, taking with them their immediate memories of that day, the sensory details and emotional impact that no written record can fully preserve. The hill itself remains on Okinawa, part of an island that has transformed utterly from the battlefield. It was in 1945 into a modern society where the scars of war have been largely erased by time and reconstruction. If you visited the site today, you would find no obvious evidence of what occurred there. No marks on the landscape that would indicate the violence that once consumed this place, though perhaps if you knew what to look for you might still find fragments of metal in the soil, pieces of equipment and ordnance that survived the decades and the island's transformation. What endures beyond the physical evidence and the fading documents is the essential truth of what Clarence Craft did and what it represents about human capacity in extremis. The question that haunts anyone who studies his actions closely is the unanswerable one. Where did the courage come from? What internal resource allowed him to rise to his feet when every instinct and every rational calculation said that death awaited anyone who stood up? What enabled him to sustain that impossible assault for hours when most men would have collapsed from exhaustion or been paralyzed by fear after minutes? The answers remain elusive because courage of this magnitude resists analysis, operates according to principles that cannot be reduced to psychology or training or circumstance. Perhaps it is enough to say that on one day in May 1945, when it mattered most, one man found within himself the will to do what needed to be done regardless of cost, and by doing so he saved the lives of his comrades, achieved an objective that had seemed impossible, and added his name to the small list of individuals who in moments of crisis transcend the limits of ordinary human capability. The men who fought on Okinawa often said afterward that it was the worst battle of the war, worse than Iwo Jima, worse than Tarawa, worse than anything the Pacific Theater produced in terms of sustained brutality and unrelenting psychological pressure. The casualty figures support this assessment. American forces suffered over 62,000 casualties, including more than 12,000 dead, while Japanese military casualties exceeded 100,000 with additional tens of thousands of Okinawan civilians killed in the crossfire or by suicide. Every yard of southern Okinawa was purchased with blood, every hill and ridge and town a separate nightmare of close combat and artillery bombardment, and Hen Hill was simply one example among many of the pattern that repeated across the island throughout the spring of 1945. But Hen Hill stands out because of what Craft did there, because his actions demonstrated that even in the worst conditions imaginable, even when the odds appear insurmountable, individual courage and determination can still shape outcomes, can still break deadlocks and change the course of battles. The implications of Craft's assault extended beyond the immediate tactical situation, beyond the capture of one hill in one battle on one island. His actions became a story that was told and retold within the 96th Infantry Division and eventually throughout the wider army, becoming part of the oral tradition by which soldiers transmit lessons about combat and courage to successive generations. Young officers studying infantry tactics at military schools in the decades after World War II learned about Hen Hill as an example of aggressive action and individual initiative, though whether the lesson was to emulate Craft's example or to recognize it as a statistical anomaly that should not be expected to repeat remained a matter of debate. What was inarguable was that Craft had accomplished something that conventional tactical doctrine said was impossible, had succeeded where coordinated company-strength assaults had failed, had demonstrated that sometimes the right man in the right place at the right moment can achieve results that no amount of planning or preparation or resources can guarantee. In the end, what happened on Hen Hill matters because it reveals something fundamental about the nature of warfare and the role of the individual within it. Modern military forces rely on coordination, on combined arms and mutual support and the application of overwhelming force, on systems and procedures designed to reduce the war to manageable problems that can be solved through proper application of doctrine. But war remains a human activity, conducted by individuals who must make decisions and take actions in circumstances of extreme stress and danger. And occasionally those individuals do things that transcend doctrine and defy prediction. Clarence Craft was not superhuman, was not a trained special operator or a professional soldier with years of advanced training. He was an ordinary young man who in one moment of crisis found the strength to do something extraordinary, and by doing so he gave us a story that challenges our assumptions about human limits and possibilities, a story that demands we acknowledge that courage exists, that it matters, that it can change the course of events in ways that purely material calculations of firepower and numbers cannot predict. If you found this story of impossible courage meaningful, if it gave you a glimpse into the kind of sacrifice that shaped the world we live in today, I'd ask you to subscribe to this channel to hear more stories of the men and women who served in humanity's darkest hours. Please leave a like to help others discover Clarence Craft's story, and I want to hear from you in the comments below. Knowing what you know now about what one man did on Hen Hill, What do you think drove him to stand up when every rational instinct said to stay down? What makes a person capable of that kind of courage? Your thoughts matter, and the conversation about what these stories mean matters, because as the generation that fought these battles passes into history, we become the keepers of their memory, and it is our responsibility to ensure that what they did is not forgotten, that their courage continues to inspire and humble us, that we remember the price that was paid for the peace we enjoy.